This story is based on true events. The year was 1947. I remember it vividly, not just because it marked the beginning of an era of paranoia and mystery, but because it changed my life forever. I was a young journalist, eager to make a name for myself in the competitive world of news reporting. My editor, a grizzled veteran of the newsroom wars, called me into his office one hot July afternoon. "Thompson," he said, his voice a gravelly growl from years of chain-smoking, "I have a story for you. Head down to Roswell, New Mexico. There's been a crash. Military's involved. Could be big." I packed my bags that night and caught the first train to Roswell the next morning. The journey was uneventful, but the air grew heavier with a sense of foreboding the closer I got to my destination. As the train chugged into Roswell, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The town of Roswell was a quiet, unassuming place, nestled in the arid expanse of the New Mexico desert. The locals were friendly enough, but there was an underlying tension in their eyes, a fear they couldn't quite conceal. It wasn't long before I found out why. I made my way to the local bar, the Dusty Trail, hoping to gather some information. The bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, eyed me suspiciously as I ordered a drink. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "No," I replied. "I'm a journalist, here to cover the crash." The bar fell silent. Every patron turned to look at me, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. The bartender leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the scent of whiskey. "Listen, stranger," he whispered. "You don't want to get involved in this. There are things happening here that you wouldn't believe. It's not safe." Despite his warning, I was determined to uncover the truth. I left the bar and headed towards the crash site, a few miles out of town. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert landscape. As I approached the site, I saw the twisted remains of a metallic object, half buried in the sand. Military personnel swarmed the area, their faces stern and unreadable. I managed to slip past the perimeter, using the growing darkness to my advantage. The closer I got, the more I realized that this was no ordinary crash. The metal was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Smooth, almost liquid-like, and cold to the touch despite the desert heat. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly in the twilight. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned to see a soldier, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, dragging me away from the wreckage. "They'll come for you." "Who?" I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's coming?" He didn't answer. Instead, he shoved me into a nearby tent, where I was met by a stern-looking officer. He introduced himself as Major James Carson, and his eyes bore into mine with an intensity that made me shiver. "You're lucky we found you," he said, his voice cold and detached. "This is classified information. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I spent the next few hours being interrogated by Major Carson and his men. They asked me countless questions about who I was, what I knew, and why I was there. But it was clear they were hiding something. Every time I mentioned the symbols or the strange metal, they grew visibly uncomfortable. Eventually, they let me go, but not before issuing a stern warning. Leave Roswell immediately and never speak of what I'd seen. As I made my way back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The next few days were a blur. I stayed in a small motel on the outskirts of town, trying to piece together the fragments of information I had gathered. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end. The locals were tight-lipped, the military uncooperative. Then, one night, everything changed. I was awoken by a loud noise outside my window. Peering through the curtains, I saw a group of shadowy figures moving silently through the darkness. Their eyes glowed an unnatural green, and they moved with an eerie grace, almost as if they were floating. I watched in horror as they approached the motel, their eyes scanning the building with an otherworldly intelligence. I knew I had to leave, but fear paralyzed me. Suddenly, one of them turned towards my window, its eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I fled, grabbing only what I could carry, and ran into the desert night. The figures followed, their green eyes piercing through the darkness. I stumbled through the sand, my heart racing, until I found myself back at the crash site. The wreckage was still there, untouched and ominous. Desperation drove me to hide behind the metallic debris, hoping it would shield me from my pursuers. As I crouched in the shadows, I heard a low, humming noise emanating from the wreckage. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, casting an eerie light across the desert floor. The figures closed in, their eyes fixed on the wreckage. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. But just as they were about to reach the debris, the humming grew louder, and a blinding light erupted from the symbols. The figures froze, their eyes widening in fear. They began to retreat, moving back into the shadows from which they had emerged. I watched in disbelief as they disappeared into the night, the light from the wreckage slowly fading. Exhausted and terrified, I made my way back to town. I knew I couldn't stay in Roswell any longer. Whatever secrets the military was hiding, whatever those figures were, I wanted no part of it. I caught the first train out of Roswell the next morning, leaving behind a town shrouded in mystery and fear. But even now, years later, I can't escape the memory of that night. The symbols, the figures, the blinding light, they haunt my dreams, a constant reminder of the horrors I witnessed. The mystery of Roswell remains unsolved, a dark chapter in my life that I can never forget. Leaving Roswell didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. The images of that night replayed in my mind, a relentless loop of terror that eroded my sleep and sanity. Despite my best efforts to bury the memories, I found myself drawn back into the mystery. I couldn't let it go. The world needed to know what had happened, and I needed to understand. Back in New York, I pored over every scrap of information I could find about Roswell, UFOs, and government cover-ups. My apartment became a chaotic sea of newspaper clippings, scribbled notes, and grainy photographs. I interviewed anyone who claimed to have seen something strange or knew someone who did. Most were crackpots, but a few stories rang true, echoing my own experiences. One night, a break came. I received an anonymous letter, written in a shaky hand, postmarked from a small town in New Mexico. It read, "They're watching. Don't trust the military. Seek the truth at all costs." Enclosed was a faded photograph of the wreckage site and a set of coordinates. My heart pounded as I studied the picture. There, in the background, partially obscured by the twisted metal, was a figure, tall, slender, and unmistakably not human. Despite my fear, I knew I had to return. The coordinates led me to a remote area outside Roswell, far from the prying eyes of the military. This time, I was prepared. I armed myself with a camera, a tape recorder, and a notebook, ready to document whatever I found. The journey back to Roswell was uneventful, but the sense of dread grew with each mile. I arrived under the cover of darkness, parking my car a mile away from the coordinates. The desert was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of sand beneath my boots. As I approached the site, I felt a strange energy in the air, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The wreckage was gone, but the symbols had been burned into the ground, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I set up my camera, taking pictures of the symbols and the surrounding area. Suddenly, my tape recorder crackled to life, emitting a series of clicks and whirs. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Something, or someone, was trying to communicate. I pressed record and spoke into the device. "Who are you? What do you want?" For a moment, there was only static. Then, a voice, barely audible, whispered back, "Help us." I played the message back several times, trying to make sense of it. Help who? And from what? I felt a presence behind me and turned quickly, but saw nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I spent the next few nights in the desert, documenting everything I could. Each night, the symbols grew brighter, and the hum grew louder. The figures from my nightmare appeared again, always at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I tried to approach them. They seemed to be guiding me, leading me deeper into the mystery. One night, as I reviewed my notes and recordings, I heard footsteps approaching my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the sound. A man stood there, his face obscured by a hood. "You need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "They're coming for you." "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you know about this?" He stepped closer, lowering his hood. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow and haunted. "My name is Dr. Alan Grayson. I worked at the base when the crash happened. We tried to contain it, but it was too powerful. They're not from here, and they're not friendly." Dr. Grayson told me a chilling tale of secret experiments and government cover-ups. The crash was no accident. It was an attempt by the beings to make contact. But the military's aggressive actions had triggered a violent response. The figures I'd seen were survivors, trying to reclaim their lost technology and seek revenge. "They won't stop," Grayson warned. "They can manipulate our minds, make us see things that aren't there. If you stay, they'll find you." I was torn. I wanted to leave to escape the nightmare, but I also felt a responsibility to uncover the truth. Before I could respond, Grayson handed me a small, metallic device. "This will help you understand," he said, "but use it wisely. It can show you things you can't unsee." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the device. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its cold weight. A series of symbols were etched into its surface, similar to those I'd seen at the crash site. I activated the device, and a holographic image flickered to life. It showed the crash from a different perspective. The being's perspective. I saw their ship, sleek and alien, descending towards Earth. But something went wrong. A beam of light shot up from the ground, striking the ship and sending it spiraling out of control. They hadn't come to invade. They had come in peace, only to be attacked without warning. As the hologram played out, I felt a wave of sorrow and anger wash over me. These beings had been misunderstood, their intentions twisted by fear and paranoia. The symbols, the strange energy. It was all a desperate plea for help. I knew then that I couldn't leave. I had to find a way to communicate with them, to bridge the gap between our worlds. I spent the next few days trying to decode the symbols, using the device Grayson had given me. Slowly, I began to understand their language, a complex blend of images and sounds. One night, as I worked, the symbols on the ground flared to life. The hum grew louder, resonating through my entire being. I felt a presence beside me and turned to see one of the figures, its green eyes glowing with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I held up the device, showing it the hologram. "I understand," I said, hoping it could comprehend my words. "I want to help." The figure stepped closer, and I felt a connection form, a bridge between our minds. Images flashed before my eyes. Their home planet, a world of beauty and technology, now lost. Their journey to Earth, a mission of exploration and friendship. The crash, and their subsequent suffering. I realized that they were not here to harm us. They wanted to coexist, to share their knowledge and learn from us. but fear and mistrust had turned them into enemies. As the connection deepened, I saw a way forward. If I could show the world the truth, if I could prove that these beings meant no harm, perhaps we could find a way to live together in peace. But it wouldn't be easy. The military would do everything in its power to suppress the information, to maintain the status quo. I spent the next few days gathering as much evidence as I could. I recorded the figures, their messages, their attempts to communicate. I documented the symbols, the strange energy, the holograms. I knew I was risking my life, but the truth was worth it. One night, as I prepared to leave the desert, I felt a familiar presence. Dr. Grayson appeared, his face etched with concern. "They know what you're doing," he warned. "They're coming for you. You have to leave now." I packed up my equipment, the weight of the evidence heavy on my shoulders. As I drove away from the site, I saw military vehicles in the distance, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They were too late. I had what I needed. Back in New York, I compiled my findings, creating a detailed report. I contacted trusted colleagues, journalists who I knew would believe me and help me get the story out. We worked tirelessly, piecing together the truth and preparing for the inevitable backlash. The day the story broke, the world changed. The evidence was undeniable, the truth too powerful to ignore. Governments were forced to admit what had happened, to acknowledge the existence of extraterrestrial life and their intentions. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to right the wrongs of the past. But not everyone was ready to accept the truth. Fear and paranoia still lingered, and there were those who sought to exploit the situation for their own gain. The road ahead was uncertain, but I remained hopeful. We had taken the first step towards understanding, towards a future where we could coexist. The figures continued to visit me in my dreams, their green eyes now filled with gratitude. They had found a voice through me, a way to tell their story. And though the journey was far from over, I knew that together we could find a path to peace. The mystery of Roswell was no longer a tale of fear and secrecy. It was a story of hope, a testament to the power of truth and the possibility of a new beginning. In the months that followed the publication of our story, the world grappled with the revelation. The existence of extraterrestrial life was no longer a topic of science fiction, but a stark reality. The global response was mixed. Awe, fear, excitement, and skepticism all mingled in the public discourse. Governments held emergency meetings, scientists clamored to understand the implications, and ordinary people looked to the skies with a new sense of wonder and trepidation. Despite the initial shock, the truth began to settle in. The beings from Roswell, now known as the visitors, were not the malevolent invaders many had feared. Their intentions, as I had discovered, were rooted in curiosity and a desire for peaceful coexistence. But the journey to mutual understanding was fraught with challenges. The military, still reeling from the exposure of their secrets, reluctantly opened a dialogue with the visitors. Diplomatic channels were established, and a team of scientists and linguists was assembled to facilitate communication. I was invited to join this team, my experiences and knowledge deemed invaluable. Our base of operations was set up in a secure facility in the New Mexico desert, not far from the original crash site. The visitors had agreed to meet us there, and I felt a mix of anticipation and dread as I made my way to the facility. The desert, once a place of fear, had become a beacon of hope. The first face-to-face meeting was a historic moment. The visitors arrived in a sleek, silver craft that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. As they disembarked, I felt a profound sense of connection. These were the beings I had seen in my dreams, the ones who had reached out to me in desperation. Our initial interactions were cautious. The visitors communicated through a combination of gestures, images, and sounds. Their language, a complex blend of visual and auditory signals, was unlike anything we had encountered. But with the help of the device Dr. Grayson had given me, we made progress. Over time, we learned more about the visitors' home planet, a world they called Lumera. It was a place of advanced technology and natural beauty, but it had been ravaged by a cataclysmic event. Seeking refuge and new opportunities, they had ventured into space, hoping to find a new home among the stars. Our exchanges revealed the depth of their suffering and the resilience of their spirit. They were a peaceful race, valuing knowledge and cooperation above all else. Their ship had come to Earth not as a harbinger of doom, but as an olive branch, a gesture of goodwill. As our understanding grew, so did the bond between us. The visitors began to share their technology, offering insights into their advanced energy sources and medical knowledge. In return, we provided them with information about our planet and our culture. It was a mutual exchange, a blending of worlds. But not everyone welcomed this new alliance. Groups of extremists, fueled by fear and ignorance, saw the visitors as a threat. Protests erupted, and acts of violence were committed against those who sought to work with them. The military, still wary, maintained a tight grip on the situation, often stifling progress in the name of security. One night, as I reviewed the latest data from our interactions, I received a visit from Dr. Grayson. His appearance had changed. He looked older, more weary, the weight of the past evident in his eyes. "We're on the brink of something extraordinary," he said, taking a seat across from me. "But it's fragile. There are forces at play that would rather see us fail." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "What can we do?" "We must continue to build trust," he replied, "both with the visitors and within our own ranks. The truth must prevail, but it won't be easy. There are those who profit from fear and division." Our conversation was interrupted by a loud explosion. The ground shook, and alarms blared through the facility. We rushed outside to see smoke rising from the edge of the compound. A group of armed men had breached the perimeter, their intentions clear. "Protect the visitors," Grayson shouted, and we scrambled to shield them from the attackers. The ensuing chaos was a blur of gunfire and shouting. I saw several of my colleagues fall, struck down by the invaders. The visitors, though capable of defending themselves, chose not to retaliate, their peaceful nature guiding their actions. In the midst of the turmoil, I found myself face to face with one of the attackers. His eyes were wild with fear and hatred, his weapon aimed directly at me. Time seemed to slow as I stared down the barrel of his gun, my heart pounding in my chest. But before he could pull the trigger, a blinding light enveloped us. The visitors had activated a protective shield, a last resort to prevent further bloodshed. The light was warm, almost soothing, and the attacker lowered his weapon, a look of confusion replacing his anger. In the aftermath of the attack, several of the extremists were apprehended, and the rest fled into the night. The facility was heavily damaged, but the visitors were unharmed. It was a sobering reminder of the fragility of our alliance, the constant threat of those who would rather see us divided. The following days were tense. Security was tightened, and trust became a precious commodity. But through it all, the visitors remained steadfast, their belief in our potential for cooperation unwavering. Dr. Grayson and I worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost. We held meetings with community leaders, scientists, and even skeptics, fostering dialogue and addressing concerns. Slowly, the tide began to turn. People started to see the visitors not as invaders, but as allies. One evening, as the sun set over the desert, casting a golden glow on the sand, I stood with one of the visitors, a being I had come to know as Ela. We watched the horizon in silence, the weight of the past months heavy on our shoulders. "We have much to learn from each other," Ela said, their voice a melodic whisper. but we must move forward with open hearts and minds. I nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for this journey. We will. Together, we can create a future where fear no longer divides us. The story of Roswell, once a tale of fear and mystery, had become a beacon of hope. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges, but it was a path worth taking. As I looked at the stars that night, I felt a sense of peace. The mystery of Roswell had been unraveled, and in its place, a new chapter was beginning, one of unity, understanding, and the promise of a brighter future. Years have passed since that fateful night in Roswell. The visitors and humanity have forged a bond that transcends our differences. Their technology has revolutionized our world, bringing advancements in medicine, energy, and communication. In return, we have shared our culture, our history, and our dreams. The initial fear and resistance have given way to acceptance and cooperation. Schools now teach about the visitors as part of our shared history, and their presence is a common sight in our cities. The once secret facility in New Mexico has become a center for interspecies collaboration, a symbol of what we can achieve when we work together. I continue my work as a journalist, documenting our ongoing journey with the visitors. The story of Roswell is no longer shrouded in secrecy, but celebrated as the beginning of a new era. It's a reminder of the power of truth, the importance of understanding, and the endless possibilities that await when we embrace the unknown. As I reflect on those early days, the fear and uncertainty, I am filled with a profound sense of hope. The visitors came to us in peace, and despite the obstacles, we have honored that intention. Together, we have built a bridge between worlds, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the boundless potential of unity. The stars, once a source of mystery and fear, now beckon with the promise of new horizons. And as we continue to explore the cosmos, we do so not as isolated beings, but as part of a greater whole, a universe rich with life, knowledge, and the endless potential for discovery. The mystery of Roswell was just the beginning, and the journey ahead is a story yet to be written.